rose garden at Thornwell Manor had always been a place of quiet beauty, a sanctuary where the wealthy and well-bred could take their afternoon tea among the perfectly pruned blooms. That was why the sudden and violent death of Sir Geoffrey Lonsdale, the estate's esteemed owner, sent ripples of shock through the sleepy village of Little Darley. He had been found that morning, sprawled in the middle of the garden's grand pathway, his body oddly contorted as though he had fallen from a great height, and yet there was no structure tall enough nearby to suggest such a fall was possible. Miss Jane Marple, having been visiting an old friend in the village, heard of the news at breakfast in the cosy sitting room of her host, Mrs. Edith Grantham. Mrs. Grantham, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the tea, recounted what little she had heard. Poor Sir Geoffrey, dead in the rose garden of all places, and the doctor says it must have happened late last night, though how he ended up there is beyond me. The constable found something most peculiar, a single red chess piece, a knight lying beside his hand. Isn't that the strangest thing? Miss Marple's delicate fingers stilled around her teacup. A chess piece? She echoed, her mind already stirring. It was only natural that she would find herself drawn into the mystery. The local constabulary, while diligent, had little experience in the way of complex murder cases, and Inspector Morton, the man in charge, had never been one to dismiss a keen mind, especially one with Miss Marple's remarkable reputation. By the time she arrived at Thornwell Manor that afternoon, the grounds were abuzz with whispered speculation. The scene was, as Mrs. Grantham had said, most peculiar. Sir Geoffrey's body lay in the middle of the path, surrounded by scattered rose petals. There were no signs of a struggle, no weapon in sight. His face was strangely peaceful, but his position, his arms twisted unnaturally, one leg bent under him, suggested a fall. The chess piece, the small red knight, had been placed with deliberate precision near his hand. What do you make of it? Miss Marple? Inspector Morton asked, watching as she took in the details with her sharp, pale blue eyes. She did not answer immediately, but instead knelt beside the body, observing. No footprints in the damp earth except for his own, she murmured. And yet, if he fell, where did he fall from? That's just it. He couldn't have fallen, Morton said, exasperated. There's no sign of a struggle, no forced entry to the house. We checked his study where he was last seen writing letters. Everything was in place. And yet, here he is, dead in the garden. Miss Marple nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. And this chess piece, that's another oddity. Sir. Geoffrey played chess often, but this is an unusual set, red, not the standard black and white. His own set is still in his study, perfectly arranged, and we found no other pieces, just this one. Miss Marple picked up the knight carefully, turning it over in her fingers. The weight of it suggested solid wood, but the base had a curious, rough edge, as if it had been tampered with. She slipped it into her handbag. I should like to have a closer look at this, she said. By all means, Morton replied. But what do you think it means? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, my dear Inspector, it is far too early to say. But I do believe this was no accident. A short distance away, beyond the neatly trimmed hedges, a figure watched them intently before slipping away unseen. Miss Marple left the rose garden with measured steps, her sharp mind already sorting through the puzzle laid before her. The red chess knight, a deliberate placement, surely. But a clue left by whom? The killer, playing a game, or Sir Geoffrey himself in his final moments. She made her way back toward the house, its stone facade standing solemn under the weight of the morning's events. As she approached, she noticed a cluster of people lingering near the grand entrance, their conversations hushed and watchful. Among them was Eleanor Lonsdale, Sir Geoffrey's much younger wife, her pale hands clutching a lace handkerchief. She was speaking in low tones to a tall, severe-looking man Miss Marple recognized as Mr. Harold Fenchurch, Sir Geoffrey's solicitor. Eleanor's grief was composed, almost rehearsed, though Miss Marple noted how her eyes darted toward the gathered servants, then quickly away again, as if weighing something in her mind. Harold Fenchurch's face, on the other hand, bore no grief at all, only calculation. The arrival of Inspector Morton caused the group to fall silent. "Lady Lonsdale," he addressed Eleanor formally, "may I trouble you with a few more questions?" Eleanor lifted her chin, her voice steady. "Of course. Inspector, whatever I can do to assist." Miss Marple, feigning absent-mindedness, stepped closer, listening carefully. "Where were you last night?" Morton asked. "I retired early, around 10, Eleanor replied smoothly. "Sir Geoffrey stayed in his study, going over some papers. He often worked late." Morton scribbled in his notebook. "And you didn't see or hear anything unusual?" She hesitated, just for a second. "No," she said. But Miss Marple saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Harold Fenchurch cleared his throat. "Inspector, Lady Lonsdale is still in shock. Surely this can wait." "No, Mr. Fenchurch, it's quite all right," Eleanor interrupted, her lips pressed together, as if steeling herself. "I did wake once in the early hours. I thought I heard something, perhaps movement outside, but when I listened again it was quiet." Miss Marple observed the solicitor's reaction. He was not relieved by Eleanor's honesty. In fact, his fingers twitched ever so slightly at his side. "Did you look out your window?" Morton asked. Eleanor shook her head. "No. I told myself I was imagining things and went back to sleep." Miss Marple gave a small, polite cough. "Forgive me, my dear, but did Sir Geoffrey often take late-night walks in the garden?" Eleanor looked startled, as though the thought had not occurred to her. "No, I don't believe so." "Odd, isn't it?" Miss Marple mused. "That he should be found there at such an hour." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her handkerchief. Yes, it is." Morton turned his attention to Fenchurch. "And you, sir? Where were you last night?" Fenchurch adjusted his cuffs. "At home, Inspector. I had no business with Sir Geoffrey yesterday." But Miss Marple, ever perceptive, noted that he avoided Eleanor's gaze as he spoke. A commotion at the far end of the corridor drew their attention. A frazzled-looking maid, her apron slightly askew, rushed forward. "Pardon me, sir, but I just remembered something." She wrung her hands nervously. "It might not mean anything, but I heard a sound last night, too. A sharp noise, like something breaking. I was in the kitchen, and it came from outside." Morton frowned. "And you didn't report this earlier?" "I thought it was an animal knocking something over. I didn't think it could be important." Miss Marple's expression remained kindly, but inwardly she noted something crucial. A sound like breaking, and the body twisted unnaturally as though he had fallen. But from where? She glanced at the staircase nearby, then at the large study window overlooking the garden. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Inspector," she said sweetly, "I wonder if I might take a look at Sir Geoffrey's study." Morton hesitated, but nodded. Of Course, Miss Marple. As they entered, the air smelled faintly of ink and parchment. The room was immaculately kept, nothing out of place. A large oak desk stood in the centre, papers neatly stacked, and against the far wall, a chessboard. Miss Marple drifted toward it, her fingers lightly grazing the polished wooden pieces. The board was set mid-game, a match abandoned in progress. White was winning, but one piece was missing. A knight. She turned back to Morton. Sir Geoffrey was playing a game, you see, and yet the missing knight was found outside by his body. Now, why do you suppose that is? Morton rubbed his chin. You think he took it outside with him? Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, or perhaps someone else placed it there. As a message, she glanced toward the large window. It was closed, but when she reached out and unlatched it, the frame moved stiffly, as though it had not been opened in some time. Yet, when she examined the sill, a faint scratch stood out against the polished wood. Something had disturbed it. A fall, she whispered to herself. But not from the ground. Her mind whirred. The sound of breaking the maid had heard. The unnatural position of the body, the missing chess piece, and a window that bore the faintest trace of disturbance. It was no accident. Sir Geoffrey had fallen. But from where? And who had been with him when he did? A faint smile touched Miss Marple's lips. "Inspector," she said, "I do believe we are missing a very important conversation with one of our guests. Somewhere in the house, someone was keeping a secret, and Miss Marple intended to uncover it." Miss Marple took a final glance at the disturbed window before turning to Inspector Morton. "If I might make a small suggestion, Inspector, perhaps we should speak again with those in the house, individually if possible. I do believe we shall find that not all recollections align quite as they should." Morton gave a short nod, then gestured to one of the constables. "Send for Lady Lonsdale first." Eleanor arrived a few minutes later, her composure intact, but her hands twisting the lace handkerchief in her lap. She sat in the high-backed chair across from the inspector's desk, her gaze flickering toward Miss Marple before settling on Morton. "You wish to speak with me again, Inspector?" "Just a few clarifications, Lady Lonsdale," Morton said. "You mentioned that you retired early last night and awoke once, hearing something outside. Around what time do you suppose that was?" Eleanor hesitated just for a fraction of a second. "Perhaps 2 in the morning," she said. "I recall looking at the clock on my bedside table." Miss Marple noted the detail. Precise, but volunteered only after hesitation. "And you said you did not look out the window?" she asked gently. Eleanor shook her head. "No, I assumed it was nothing." "Forgive me for asking, my dear," Miss Marple continued, "but were you and Sir Geoffrey on good terms of late?" Eleanor stiffened. "What do you mean?" "It's just that, well, sometimes when a gentleman of means marries a lady much younger than himself, there can be misunderstandings, different expectations." Eleanor's lips parted slightly before she pressed them together, her grip on the handkerchief tightening. "Sir Geoffrey and I had an arrangement. He valued companionship, and I valued security. It was comfortable." Miss Marple did not fail to notice how carefully she had chosen her words. Morton leaned forward slightly. "And yet, Lady Lonsdale, I must ask, was there anyone else? Someone who might have wanted Sir Geoffrey out of the way?" Eleanor's face paled. "That's a horrid accusation, Inspector." "It is merely a question," Miss Marple soothed. watching her closely. "But perhaps we should speak with Mr. Fenchurch next, don't you agree?" Eleanor did not protest, but something dark flickered across her expression. When she rose and left, her steps were just a fraction too quick, as though eager to escape. Mr. Harold Fenchurch entered soon after, his sharp eyes immediately assessing the situation. He did not sit until invited, and even then he remained poised, hands resting lightly on his knees. "I assume this is regarding last night," he said smoothly. "It is," Morton confirmed. "You stated earlier that you were at home. But I must ask, do you often visit Thornwell Manor late in the evening?" Fenchurch's expression did not change. "No, I do not." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "How curious, then, that I overheard one of the maids mention seeing your carriage not far from the estate. Quite late last night. Was that not you, Mr. Fenchurch?" For the first time, a flicker of something, annoyance, passed over his face. "I may have passed by. Business matters required my attention, and I had much to think on." Miss Marple nodded. "Ah, yes. Legal affairs can be quite demanding. Tell me, was there anything of particular urgency regarding Sir Geoffrey's estate?" Fenchurch hesitated, just long enough for Miss Marple to take notice. "No," he said finally, "merely routine matters." Morton's brow furrowed. "Would you say Sir Geoffrey was under any pressure? Financial difficulties, disputes with anyone?" Fenchurch's reply was too quick. "None at all." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "How very fortunate, considering the rather heavy investments he made just last month. Quite a risk, I imagine, for a man his age." Fenchurch's jaw tightened. "I see you've been making inquiries, Miss Marple. But I assure you, Sir Geoffrey was quite competent in his dealings." Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "Of course. And yet, I do wonder, was he competent enough to ensure those investments were truly sound? Or did someone stand to gain from his unfortunate demise?" Fenchurch's mouth thinned. "If you are implying that I had anything to do with this tragedy, you are quite mistaken." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed lightly. "Perhaps not." As Fenchurch rose to leave, his movements were deliberate, controlled. But Miss Marple did not miss the tension in his shoulders as he exited. When he was gone, Morton let out a breath. "That man knows more than he's saying," Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Yes, but you see, Inspector, it is not always what people say that interests me. It is what they do not." Morton gave her a thoughtful look. "And what is it they are not saying?" Miss Marple patted her handbag, where the red knight still rested. "That, dear Inspector, is what we must uncover." Miss Marple sat in a quiet corner of the study, her keen eyes drifting over the chessboard once more. The missing knight had been found beside Sir Geoffrey's body, but why? A message, a symbol, perhaps even an oversight in the killer's carefully laid plan. She turned it over in her hand, feeling the rough edge at its base. Tampered with. But how? Inspector Morton, seated across from her, rubbed his temples. "We've 3 people with motives, Miss Marple, but none of them explain how Sir Geoffrey ended up dead in the middle of his own garden without a struggle. Eleanor Lonsdale, the grieving widow, younger, certainly poised to inherit a great deal. Fenchurch, the solicitor who knows far more than he's saying. And then there's the unseen factor, the person Sir Geoffrey might have been meeting in secret." Miss Marple nodded, her voice soft but certain. "We mustn't forget the element of fear, Inspector. Not all motives stem from greed. Sometimes People act not because they wish to gain something, but because they are desperate to avoid something. Morton frowned. Are you saying Sir Geoffrey wasn't simply murdered for his fortune? Miss Marple's fingers brushed the night again. Perhaps not. She rose and, after a moment's contemplation, walked over to Sir Geoffrey's writing desk. It was immaculately kept, his papers neatly arranged, a fountain pen resting precisely in its holder. But something felt too neat, too perfect. She reached for the blotter paper and ran her fingers over the last page he had written on. She could faintly make out the indentations of a letter, though the page itself had been removed. A missing note, she murmured. Morton leaned forward. You think he wrote to someone? Perhaps he was meeting someone, Miss Marple said. Perhaps he was afraid of something he intended to put in writing. She turned to the constable, standing near the door. Would you be so kind as to fetch the household staff? I should like to ask a few questions about Sir Geoffrey's habits. Minutes later, the housekeeper, Mrs. Forbes, bustled in, her face pale but composed. I do hope I can be of help, Miss Marple, she said, twisting her hands in her apron. I am certain you shall be, my dear, Miss Marple said warmly. Tell me, did Sir Geoffrey ever mention receiving threats? Or seem nervous, preoccupied? Mrs. Forbes hesitated. Not exactly threats, ma'am, but he did seem troubled these past few weeks. Kept to himself more than usual, and he sent a letter out just yesterday evening. Morton straightened. A letter? Do you know to whom? The housekeeper shook her head. No, sir, but he was very particular about it. Told me it had to go at once. I gave it to young Charlie, the errand boy, to take into town. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. Did he say what it was about? Only that it was urgent. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Morton. Inspector, I do believe we must find young Charlie at once. The errand boy, when found at the stables, was more than willing to talk. Yes, ma'am. I took the letter into town yesterday just before supper, he said eagerly. It was for Mr. Roger Clarendon, the banker. Morton's expression darkened. Clarendon? Why would Sir Geoffrey be writing to his banker the night before his death? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Perhaps he was trying to stop something before it was too late. The banker, Roger Clarendon, was a thin, precise man with spectacles perched low on his nose. He received them in his office with a carefully neutral expression. Yes, I received a letter from Sir Geoffrey, he admitted. It arrived late, and I did not read it until this morning. He slid open a drawer and withdrew a neatly folded sheet of paper. Morton unfolded it and read aloud. Clarendon. The matter of the funds must be halted at once. I was deceived. Do not proceed further until we meet tomorrow. Miss Marple inhaled lightly. And were you planning to meet him, Mr. Clarendon? Clarendon hesitated. I assumed he meant to discuss the investment he made recently, a substantial sum transferred overseas. Morton scowled. Who convinced him to invest? Clarendon adjusted his glasses. It was his solicitor, Harold Fenchurch, who handled the legal matters. He vouched for the legitimacy. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And was it legitimate, Mr. Clarendon? The banker sighed. Not entirely. There were inconsistencies. I had my doubts, but Sir Geoffrey insisted. Morton rose abruptly. Fenchurch. The man lied to us. He knew there was trouble. Miss Marple placed a calming hand on his sleeve. Yes, Inspector. But let us be certain we understand how this all fits together. They returned to Thornwell Manor, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the garden. Fenchurch was in the drawing-room, but when he saw them enter, his eyes flickered with something close to resignation. Morton wasted no time. "We know about the funds, Fenchurch. Sir Geoffrey wanted to stop the transaction. He realized he had been deceived." Fenchurch's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple sighed softly. "Oh, but you do. The night before his death, Sir Geoffrey learned the truth. He intended to act, to expose the fraud. But someone made sure he never had the chance. Eleanor Lonsdale, who had been sitting quietly near the fireplace, suddenly stood. "You think Harold killed Geoffrey?" Fenchurch scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. Why would I do such a thing?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because, dear Mr. Fenchurch, if Sir Geoffrey had spoken to his banker this morning, he would have exposed you." Eleanor's hand trembled at her side. "You mean the investments weren't real?" "Some were," Miss Marple said kindly. "But some, I suspect, were quite the opposite, and Sir Geoffrey had begun to suspect the same. That is why he wrote to Mr. Clarendon in such a hurry." Fenchurch's face darkened. "This is absurd. You have no proof that I—" "Ah, but we do," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "We know that you were near the estate last night. You claimed it was mere coincidence. But Sir Geoffrey was lured outside. He fell, and you placed the chess piece beside him, hoping to stage a mystery rather than a crime." Fenchurch's breath came quicker now. "You can't prove anything," Miss Marple smiled gently. "That is the thing about deception, Mr. Fenchurch. It unravels so very easily once a single thread is pulled." Morton stepped forward. "I think we'll have that conversation down at the station." Fenchurch's eyes darted about the room, but there was no escape. Eleanor let out a shuddering breath, sinking into a chair. "I thought he was just Geoffrey's solicitor," she whispered. "I never imagined." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Sometimes, my dear, the greatest deception is the one we tell ourselves." As Fenchurch was led away, the sun fully set, casting the rose garden into deep shadow. But inside, the light of truth had finally shone through. As Fenchurch was taken, away in the custody of 2 constables, Inspector Morton allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. "Well, Miss Marple, I must say, you've done it again. A solid case, motive as clear as day, greed, deception, and the unfortunate consequences of Sir Geoffrey's untimely realization." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Fenchurch will hang for this, I've no doubt." Miss Marple, still seated in the drawing-room, gave him a small, unreadable smile. "Perhaps, Inspector," she murmured, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Morton frowned. "You don't sound convinced." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward the chessboard once more. The missing red knight had been a clue. Of that she was certain. But what if it had not been a message from the murderer at all? What if it had been something else entirely? A mistake? An act of misdirection? "Tell me, Inspector," she said, her voice thoughtful, "why would Fenchurch have lured Sir Geoffrey outside when a more convenient method, poison, perhaps, or an accident indoors, would have drawn far less suspicion?" Morton waved a hand. "Desperate man makes mistakes, Miss Marple." Fenchurch was likely hoping for something that would appear more natural. Perhaps a fall in the garden, something that wouldn't immediately suggest foul play. And yet, he was careless. He left his mark. Miss Marple's fingers lightly traced the armrest of her chair. Yes, quite careless, wasn't he? Her voice remained mild, but her mind was working swiftly. Something didn't add up. Eleanor Lonsdale, still seated near the fireplace, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. She exhaled shakily, rubbing her temples. "It's over then," she murmured. "Geoffrey's murderer is in custody. There's no need for any more of this dreadful business." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "One might hope so, my dear." She glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. The evening was pressing in now, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows across the room. She observed Eleanor carefully. The young widow had been composed earlier, but now that the weight of the investigation seemed to be lifting, there was something else in her expression. Relief, fatigue, or something deeper, more elusive. Before Miss Marple could speak again, a commotion echoed from the entrance hall. The front door banged open, and a constable hurried in, his face pale. "Inspector Morton," he gasped. "There's been an attack. One of our men, Ambrose, was found outside near the stables, knocked unconscious. Morton shot to his feet." "What? Who did this?" "We don't know, sir, but Fenchurch is still in custody. The attack happened after we locked him in the carriage." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Ah," she murmured, rising from her seat with deliberate care. "Now, that is very interesting." Morton turned to her, his brows knitting together. "What do you mean?" She met his gaze, her expression calm but knowing. "It means, Inspector, that we may not have caught the real murderer after all." Eleanor let out a strangled breath. "But Fenchurch—" "Miss—" Marple shook her head. "A most convenient suspect, yes, and certainly guilty of financial deception. But murder, that I am beginning to doubt." Morton's face darkened. "You think there's someone else?" "I rather think there must be," Miss Marple said lightly. "Someone who wanted Fenchurch to take the fall. Someone who saw an opportunity in Sir Geoffrey's death to cast suspicion elsewhere." Morton swore under his breath. "Then we've been played for fools." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not fools, Inspector, only misled. But that, you see, is the essence of a truly clever crime. The best deceptions are those that lead us precisely where the criminal wants us to go." Morton was already reaching for his coat. "Come with me, Miss Marple. If there's still a murderer on the loose, we must act fast before they strike again." Miss Marple nodded, her sharp gaze flickering toward Eleanor one last time before she followed Morton out into the night. The night air was sharp and carried the scent of damp earth as Miss Marple followed Inspector Morton toward the stables. The hurried footfalls of constables echoed around them, their lanterns bobbing like restless fireflies in the darkness. The scene of the attack lay just beyond the garden, where the gravel path turned to packed dirt. Ambrose, the unfortunate constable, was being helped to his feet, his face bloodied from a blow to the temple. Morton crouched beside him. "What happened?" Ambrose winced, pressing a hand to his head. I saw someone moving in the shadows near the back gate. Thought it was a servant, but when I called out they didn't answer. Next thing I knew, something hard struck me from behind." He exhaled shakily. "Didn't see a thing, sir." Miss Marple's gaze moved toward the garden wall. A second. Figure. A lurking presence. The real murderer, watching and waiting, ensuring their escape remained unnoticed. She glanced down and noticed faint marks in the damp earth, a scuffle, but more importantly, footprints leading away from the attack. "Sight, these prints," she murmured, bending slightly. "They're smaller than a man's. A woman's, perhaps." Morton turned sharply. "A woman? You think Eleanor?" Miss Marple's gaze was contemplative. "No, I think not. She had no reason to be out here, but someone else." She trailed, off, her mind reaching for the shadowed memories of the past. Something about this crime still felt incomplete, as though an old whisper was waiting to be heard. A buried thread connecting these people in ways unseen. She straightened, turning to Morton. "Inspector, I should like to see Sir Geoffrey's old records, his letters, his personal correspondences. Is there anyone in the house who might recall events from long ago?" Morton frowned. "Mrs. Forbes, the housekeeper, has been here the longest. If there's anything from the past still lingering in this house, she would know." Minutes later, they found Mrs. Forbes in the servants' hall, her face lined with concern. "Ma'am," she said when Miss Marple entered, "I do hope you're close to catching the real villain." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I rather hope so too, my dear. But to do so, I must ask, was there ever an incident in this house that caused a great upset? Something from long ago that Sir Geoffrey might have wished to forget?" Mrs. Forbes hesitated, her hands twisting in her apron. "Well, there was something. But it was years back, mind you. No one speaks of it now." Miss Marple's voice was soft but insistent. "Please, tell me." The housekeeper sighed, folding her arms. "It was before Lady Lonsdale passed. Sir Geoffrey had a sister, Miss Margaret. She was younger than him by some years, lively and full of mischief. But then she disappeared." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Disappeared?" "She ran away," Mrs. Forbes said quietly. "One night, without a word to anyone. Sir Geoffrey was beside himself with anger, but no one ever spoke of it again. He told the staff never to mention her name." Morton folded his arms. "She never contacted the family?" "Not a word," Mrs. Forbes whispered. "It was as if she vanished." Miss Marple's mind was moving swiftly now. A missing sister, a long-buried shame, and now a murder. "Mrs. Forbes," she asked carefully, "this Miss Margaret, would you happen to have a photograph of her?" The housekeeper frowned in thought, then turned to a small cupboard. After a moment of rummaging, she produced an old, faded photograph. Miss Marple took it delicately, her breath catching as she recognized something unmistakable. The face, though younger, held striking features she had seen in the drawing room just hours before. The same sharp cheekbones, the same determined set of the mouth, Eleanor Lonsdale. Miss Marple's hands tightened on the photograph. No, not Eleanor. Eleanor had always been an enigma. Her marriage to Geoffrey had been unexpected, her past vague. She had come from abroad, or so she had claimed. And yet here, in this faded image, was a truth no one had realized. Eleanor was Margaret, Sir Geoffrey's lost sister. The realization struck like a bell. Margaret had returned, hidden in plain sight under a new name. But why? And why had Sir Geoffrey married her? She inhaled deeply, her mind piecing together the implications. If Geoffrey had known, if he had taken her back not as his sister, but as his wife, what reason could there have been? She turned to Morton, her voice quiet but urgent. "Inspector, we must speak with Eleanor Lonsdale at once." Morton hesitated, then nodded sharply. They hurried back to the drawing room, but the moment they entered, Miss Marple's eyes swept the room and knew she was gone. Eleanor had fled. Morton swore. She must have realized we were getting close. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. Then we must move quickly, Inspector, because I do not believe she intends to run forever. Morton turned to the constables. Search the house. Check the garden, the stables, the grounds. She can't have gone far. As the men rushed out, Miss Marple remained still, her mind working through the puzzle. Eleanor, Margaret, had returned for a reason. A hidden past, a desperate need. But had she killed Sir Geoffrey? Or was there yet another layer to this tangled history? Her eyes fell upon the chessboard once more, the single misplaced knight still lying there. A piece that did not belong. A move that had been played too soon. Somewhere in the darkness beyond these walls, the real endgame was unfolding. The house was in uproar. Constables scoured the grounds with lanterns, calling Eleanor's name into the cold night air. Footsteps pounded along the gravel, voices murmured in urgent tones, and yet Miss Marple remained still, her sharp eyes focused not on the chaos outside, but on the silent clues left behind. Eleanor had vanished, yes, but where had she gone? And more importantly, why now? Inspector Morton returned, breathless. No sign of her. She must have slipped away the moment she heard us coming. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the chessboard, the red knight still lying apart from the others. A piece that did not belong. She turned, walking slowly toward the writing desk, where a few scattered papers remained. Her fingers drifted over them absently before pausing at the edge of the blotter. "Inspector," she said gently, "would you indulge me in a small experiment?" Morton frowned. "An experiment?" Miss Marple smiled. "Not quite so dramatic as it sounds. Simply a way to test a suspicion." Morton exhaled. "Go on." Miss Marple took her seat by the fireplace, hands folded in her lap, and said quite clearly, "I wonder if anyone in the house recalls Margaret Lonsdale." The reaction was immediate. From the doorway, a shadow stirred. Miss Marple's sharp gaze flicked upward as Mrs. Forbes, who had been standing just beyond the threshold, stiffened. The housekeeper hesitated, her fingers tightening around her apron. "I don't know what you mean, ma'am." Miss Marple's tone remained pleasant. "Don't you? It's strange. One would think the return of Sir Geoffrey's lost sister would be quite the topic of conversation. And yet, when she arrived under a new name, no one questioned it. No one recognized her." Morton watched intently. Mrs. Forbes's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "But you knew, didn't you, Mrs. Forbes?" The older woman exhaled shakily. "You were here when Margaret ran away," Miss Marple continued. "You knew the truth before anyone else did. And yet, you said nothing." Mrs. Forbes's eyes darted toward Morton. You didn't tell Sir Geoffrey, because he already knew," Miss Marple said gently. "He married his own sister, not out of love, but out of duty, perhaps even out of guilt." Morton's face darkened. "Are you saying he married her knowing she was his sister?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and I believe that knowledge was what led to his death." Mrs. Forbes swallowed hard. "I never meant for harm to come to him." Morton took a step closer. "You knew Eleanor was really Margaret. How long have you known?" The housekeeper's lips trembled. "I suspected the moment I saw her, the way she moved, the way she looked at things. But I said nothing, I didn't know what to do. Miss Marple's expression softened. But someone else knew as well, didn't they? Someone who saw an opportunity. A tear slipped down Mrs. Forbes's cheek. "Please, ma'am, I only wanted to protect her." Miss Marple exhaled. "Mrs. Forbes, I must ask you, where is Eleanor now?" The housekeeper's hands twisted together. She's gone to the summer house. She always went there." As a girl, when she was frightened, Morton turned swiftly. "Come on." They hurried out into the night, the cold biting at their skin. The summer house stood at the edge of the estate, half hidden by ivy and the twisting limbs of old trees. A single candle burned inside. Morton pushed the door open. Eleanor sat in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked up as they entered, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "I suppose you know everything now," she murmured. Miss Marple stepped forward. "Yes, my dear," Eleanor exhaled shakily. "I didn't kill Geoffrey." Miss Marple studied her for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "I don't believe you did." Morton frowned. "Then who?" Miss Marple turned back toward the house, her mind fitting the final pieces together. "The one person who stood to lose everything if the truth came out," she murmured. And then she knew. A cold wind rattled the trees as Miss Marple and Inspector Morton made their way back toward the house, Eleanor walking between them, silent and watchful. The weight of revelation sat heavily in the night air. The truth had lurked in the shadows for so long, and now that it was finally surfacing, someone was trying desperately to push it back under. Inside, the house was still alive with activity. Constables moved through the halls, searching for anything that might explain Eleanor's sudden flight or confirm her innocence. But Miss Marple knew the real key to the mystery lay in something smaller, something overlooked, something fragile enough that it could still be taken from them. She turned to Morton. "Inspector, we must check Sir Geoffrey's study immediately." He nodded, leading the way. The study door was still slightly ajar from their earlier search, and as they stepped inside, Miss Marple's sharp eyes darted across the room. The chessboard remained undisturbed, the single red knight still lying apart from the others. The fireplace had burned low, leaving only glowing embers. But something was different. The desk. Miss Marple strode forward, her pulse quickening. The papers she had examined earlier, the scattered correspondence, the old letters, were gone. Morton stiffened. "Someone's been in here." Miss Marple's gloved fingers brushed the polished surface of the desk, her mind racing. The letters had been old, their edges yellowed and worn. She had only glimpsed a few words earlier, but one phrase had lingered in her mind. Margaret must never return. Had those letters contained Sir Geoffrey's final secret? She turned toward Morton. "Inspector, only a handful of people knew we were coming here tonight. Someone anticipated us, and they acted quickly." Morton swore under his breath. "Then they're covering their tracks. The letters must have held something incriminating." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Quite so. And yet, destruction often leaves its own trail. Tell me, where is the butler, Mr. Sloan?" Morton signalled to a constable who disappeared down the hall. Moments later, the butler appeared, his usual composure slightly frayed. "Mr. Sloan," Miss Marple said kindly, "forgive the hour, but I must ask, have you been in this room since we left?" Sloane's face remained carefully neutral. "No, madam. I've been assisting the constables with their search of the guest rooms." Miss Marple studied him. "And no one else has entered?" Sloane hesitated, then shook his head. Not to my knowledge. Morton exhaled sharply. Then whoever took the letters did so swiftly and without leaving a trace. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fireplace. The embers glowed softly, shifting slightly as a log collapsed inward. She stepped closer, bending just enough to see the faintest trace of white among the ashes. A corner of paper, curling from the heat. Her breath caught. "Inspector," she murmured. "It seems not everything was taken after all." Morton moved quickly, using the fireplace tongs to pull the fragment free before it was entirely lost. It was small, only a torn corner, but the inked words remained legible. "Dangerous if the truth must be handled before finds out. Miss." Marple's fingers curled gently around her chin. "Not much, but telling all the same." Morton's jaw tightened. Someone destroyed these letters in a hurry. But why now? Why not before? Miss Marple's eyes darkened with thought. Perhaps because they were not expecting us to look at them so closely. Whoever took them knew their importance only after we showed interest. She turned back to Sloan. "Mr. Sloan, who had access to this room after Sir Geoffrey's death?" The butler hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Primarily the household staff, madam. Mrs. Forbes, myself, and of course Mr. Pritchard." Morton frowned. "Pritchard?" "The solicitor," Sloan explained. "He came by earlier to begin sorting Sir Geoffrey's affairs." Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "Ah, how diligent." Morton's expression darkened. "I'd like a word with Mr. Pritchard, now." Sloan inclined his head. "He's staying in the guest wing, sir." Without hesitation, Morton strode toward the door, Miss Marple following at a thoughtful pace. The solicitor's room was at the far end of the hallway. When Morton knocked, there was no immediate answer. He tried again, this time more firmly. A long pause. Then, the creak of floorboards. The door opened a fraction. Pritchard stood in his robe, his face carefully neutral. "Inspector, this is rather late." Morton's voice was clipped. "Apologies, but I need to ask you some questions." Pritchard's gaze flickered toward Miss Marple. "I assume this is about Sir Geoffrey's affairs." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "In a manner of speaking." Morton stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. A leather briefcase sat open on the desk, its contents neat and orderly. But Miss Marple's gaze went to the fireplace. The embers glowed, identical to those in Sir Geoffrey's study, and a faint trace of ash dusted the rug. Her expression remained pleasant. "Mr. Pritchard, I wonder, did Sir Geoffrey ever confide in you regarding his sister?" Pritchard's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "His sister?" "Yes," Miss Marple continued. "Margaret Lonsdale, or as she is known now, Eleanor." Pritchard's face barely changed, but his grip on the desk edge did. "I don't see how that is relevant to—" "It's relevant," Morton interrupted, "because the letters in Sir Geoffrey's study have vanished. And we believe you had a hand in it." Pritchard's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's a very serious accusation, Inspector." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unyielding. "Mr. Pritchard, you were one of the few who knew about Eleanor's true identity, weren't you? Sir Geoffrey must have consulted you on the legal implications. A lost heir returning under a false name. It would have complicated things immensely, especially if Sir Geoffrey planned to change his will." Pritchard's expression remained rigid. "I have no idea what you're implying." Miss Marple's gaze fell to the fireplace again. "I believe you do." Morton took a step forward. "Where are the rest of the letters, Pritchard?" The solicitor exhaled slowly. "You have no proof that I—" A knock at the door interrupted him. A constable entered, looking somewhat flustered. "Sir, we found this in the hedge just outside the study." He held up a small leather pouch. Morton took it, opened it, and pulled out a bundle of half-burned papers. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Ah," she murmured, "how fortunate that fire doesn't always consume everything." Pritchard's face paled. Morton nodded grimly. "I think we'll be having a longer conversation, Mr. Pritchard." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. The truth was near now. She could feel it. But they had not yet reached the final move. Someone else was still waiting in the dark. A sharp gust of wind rattled the window panes as Inspector Morton secured the bundle of half-burned papers in an evidence bag. Pritchard stood motionless, his face drained of colour. Miss Marple watched him carefully, noting the way his hands gripped the edge of the desk, steady but only just. He was calculating, considering his next move, and that, more than anything, confirmed that he was still hiding something. Before Morton could press further, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. A constable appeared at the doorway, breathless. "Sir, there's been another incident. In the garden." Morton stiffened. "What sort of incident?" "A scream, sir. Mrs. Forbes heard it from the kitchen entrance. When she ran outside, she found Mr. Sloan lying by the rose trellis. He's been attacked." A cold silence filled the room. Then Morton turned on his heel and strode out, Miss Marple following close behind. The path leading to the rose garden was slick with moisture, the scent of damp earth mingling with something sharper, something metallic. A small gathering had formed near the trellis, their lanterns casting long shadows. At the center of it, Sloan lay slumped on the ground, his coat darkened by blood. Morton knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to the butler's neck. "He's alive. Get a doctor." One of the constables rushed off, while Miss Marple crouched beside Morton. Her sharp eyes swept over the scene, the torn fabric at Sloane's shoulder, the deep gash at his temple, the disturbed soil where he had clearly struggled. But what drew her attention most was his right hand, curled tightly into a fist. Gently, she pried it open. Resting in his palm was a single object, a red chess piece. The knight. Miss Marple's breath caught. It was identical to the one from Sir Geoffrey's study. Morton glanced at her. That was on him? She nodded, turning the piece over in her fingers. The base was smooth, but the edge bore a faint smear of blood. "The same red knight," she murmured. "Or perhaps a second one." Morton stood, his jaw tight. This wasn't just an attack. Someone left a message. A chill settled over the night air. Miss Marple rose, glancing toward the house. The flickering lights in the windows seemed distant, unreal. "This was meant to warn us," she said softly. "Whoever did this, they know we're close." Sloan stirred, a faint groan escaping his lips. Miss Marple knelt beside him again, her voice low and reassuring. "Mr. Sloan, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, his lips parted, and for a moment she thought he might speak. But only a weak, rasping breath emerged before his head lolled to the side. "He needs a doctor," Morton said. "Now." The constables hurried to lift him, carrying him toward the house. Miss Marple lingered, her fingers still clutching the chess piece. She turned it over again, considering. The first red knight had been lying separately on Sir Geoffrey's desk, an anomaly in an otherwise meticulously arranged chessboard. And now, here was another, or was it the same one? Her mind whirred through the possibilities. The chess piece had meaning beyond its surface. It was not just a message, it was a signature. A move in a game. Morton's voice broke through her thoughts. This changes things. Pritchard might have destroyed those letters, but this attack tells me someone else is just as desperate to keep secrets buried. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the chess piece. Yes, she murmured. And the question now is, who made the next move? Morton exhaled, rubbing his temples. We need to speak to the household again. Someone must have seen something. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable as she slipped the chess piece into her coat pocket. Yes, she agreed, and I rather think the real game has only just begun. The house was restless. A hush had fallen over the corridors, an uneasy silence broken only by the occasional murmur of servants and the distant clatter of someone moving hastily in the kitchen. Miss Marple followed Inspector Morton into the study, where the weight of the investigation pressed heavier than before. The attack on Sloan had changed things, not just because of the violence of it, but because of the deliberate message it carried. Someone was playing a game, and they were confident enough to make the next move in plain sight. Morton paced in front of the fireplace, running a hand through his hair. A red knight, he muttered. It has to mean something. And if it's the same one that was on Sir Geoffrey's desk, or a second identical piece, Miss Marple interjected thoughtfully. She withdrew the chess piece from her pocket, rolling it between her fingers. The game of chess is a precise one, Inspector. A well-played move is never random. He exhaled sharply. Then what does it mean? Miss Marple lowered herself into a chair, her gaze flickering toward the chessboard still resting atop Sir Geoffrey's desk. It means someone is following a strategy, and that strategy may be more literal than we assumed. Morton frowned, stepping closer to examine the board. The pieces remained as they had been left, the game frozen in time, as if its players had simply walked away mid-match. His eyes scanned the arrangement, brow furrowing. I don't know much about chess, he admitted, but this setup doesn't look like a normal game. The red knight was missing, wasn't it? Yes, Miss Marple confirmed, and now it has reappeared, with a second crime. A thought had been nagging at the back of her mind since the moment she'd first seen the disrupted board. She studied the positioning of the remaining pieces, the careful placement of the pawns, the king, the queen. It wasn't arbitrary, it was deliberate. She turned the red knight over in her hand. The smear of blood on its base had begun to dry, darkening against the polished surface. And then something clicked. Her eyes widened slightly. Inspector, she said slowly, the positioning of the pieces. This isn't just a chess game. It's a reenactment. Morton frowned. A reenactment of what? She rose, moving toward the desk, her finger tracing the air above the board. See here, these pieces aren't positioned in the middle of an ongoing game. They reflect a moment, a particular arrangement. She reached for a bishop, her fingers hovering over it for a moment before she hesitated and withdrew. The bishop is out of place, she murmured. It should be here. She moved it slightly, adjusting it to match the mental image forming in her mind. Then she stepped back, staring at the arrangement. Morton stared at her. Miss Marple, you're saying this board is set up to mirror something else? She nodded, her voice quiet. Yes, a very specific moment in time. I believe this arrangement reflects the position of the people in the room the night Sir Geoffrey was killed. Morton's breath caught. He leaned in, studying the layout again, but the full weight of her realization hadn't yet settled on him. Are you saying someone deliberately arranged this board to recreate the crime scene? Yes, she said, and I believe that person is the killer. She placed the red knight where she suspected it had originally stood. The missing piece, she murmured, removed from the board because it represented the murderer. Morton straightened sharply. You mean this knight symbolizes the killer? Miss Marple nodded. And if that is the case, then its reappearance tonight was no coincidence. It was a message. Morton exhaled. Whoever attacked Sloan wasn't just silencing him. They were making sure we understood that they were still in control. Miss Marple studied the board once more, her mind working through every possible implication. And then, her eyes landed on one piece in particular, the Queen, positioned in such a way that it seemed to hold command over the board. Something about it stirred a memory, an offhand remark, a moment too subtle to notice before, and suddenly it was clear. She turned sharply toward Morton, her voice steady but urgent. Inspector, we need to speak to Mrs. Pritchard. The house felt different now, as though the very walls had absorbed the tension that hung in the air. Miss Marple and Inspector Morton moved quickly through the dimly lit corridor, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. The urgency in their pace was unmistakable. The realization that had struck Miss Marple moments ago had changed everything. Mrs. Pritchard had been a presence in the investigation from the start, dignified, composed, and quietly sorrowful. But there had always been something about her that did not quite fit, an invisible thread running through the case that now threatened to unravel completely. As they reached the sitting room, they found her standing by the fireplace, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not look surprised to see them. If anything, her expression was one of quiet resignation. Mrs. Pritchard, Miss Marple said gently, stepping forward. We need to speak with you about the night Sir Geoffrey was killed. A flicker of emotion crossed her face, too quick to catch. I've already told you everything I know, she said evenly. Miss Marple studied her closely. Yes, but I don't think you told us everything that truly mattered. A muscle in Mrs. Pritchard's jaw tensed. Morton took a step closer. We know that the chessboard in Sir Geoffrey's study wasn't just a game. It was a reflection of that night, the people in the room, their positions. Someone arranged it that way deliberately. And the missing red knight. He let the words hang between them. For the first time, Mrs. Pritchard looked directly at the piece Miss Marple held between her fingers. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, of memory. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. You see, my dear, the knight was removed from the board because it represented the killer. The game was unfinished because the final move had yet to be made, but now it has reappeared, alongside another attack. That tells us that the murderer has not yet finished their game. Mrs. Pritchard exhaled slowly. And you think that murderer is me? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she took a small step closer. I think this is about more than simple revenge, more than greed. This was about something deeply personal, something rooted in the past. A silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. And then, at last, Mrs. Pritchard spoke. You're right. Morton stiffened, but Miss Marple did not move. Mrs. Pritchard let out a slow, trembling breath. This wasn't about money. It was never about money. Her voice was quieter now, tinged with something raw. It was about what Sir Geoffrey took from me, something that can never be replaced. Miss Marple's mind moved quickly, piecing together the fragments of truth that had been lingering beneath the surface all along. "You knew him long before you married Pritchard, didn't you?" she said softly. Mrs. Pritchard gave a small, humourless laugh. "Knew him?" Her gaze flickered toward the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. "I loved him." A stillness settled over the room. "He and I were young," she continued, her voice distant. "It feels like a lifetime ago. He made promises, so many promises, and I believed every one of them." Her hands tightened. But Sir Geoffrey was not a man of honour. He discarded people when they no longer served his purpose, and when I was no longer convenient to him, he discarded me too. Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, but her mind was racing. Mrs. Pritchard let out a slow breath. "I was ruined after that. He married someone else, of course, someone suitable, and I married Mr. Pritchard, a good man, a kind man." A shadow of sorrow passed over her face. "But some wounds don't heal." She turned back to them, her voice steady now. "I spent years watching Sir Geoffrey thrive while I carried the weight of what he had done, and then, when I learned that he had done it again—" She shook her head. "I couldn't allow it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Again?" Mrs. Pritchard's lips pressed together. The girl, Eleanor, the maid. He had begun preying on her just as he had once done to me. Promises, lies, a pattern always the same. Morton swore under his breath. "And when you found out?" Mrs. Pritchard lifted her chin. "I knew I couldn't let it happen again." A silence followed, thick, heavy, final. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "And so you killed him." Mrs. Pritchard did not deny it. She simply nodded. "I waited until the house was quiet. He was in his study, as he always was. I knew the layout of the room. I knew how to make it look as though it had been a struggle. And the chessboard." Her lips twitched in something like dark amusement. "That was his vanity. He loved that game. Thought of himself as a master strategist." Her eyes met Miss Marple's. "But he was never quite as clever as he believed." Morton's voice was firm. "You attacked Sloan tonight." For the first time, Mrs. Pritchard hesitated. "No." Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. "No?" She shook her head. "I had no reason to hurt Sloan. The moment I killed Sir Geoffrey, my work was finished. I have no regrets about what I did, but I swear to you I did not strike him." Miss Marple studied her closely. There was truth in her eyes. A new, chilling realization crept into her thoughts. If Mrs. Pritchard had no reason to attack Sloan, then someone else did. The game was not over. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, the weight of her realization settling like a dense fog in her mind. Mrs. Pritchard had confessed, but the attack on Sloan had nothing to do with her. That meant there was still another hand in play, one that had remained hidden, manipulating the board from the shadows. Inspector Morton, sensing the same shift in the air, narrowed his eyes. "If you didn't attack Sloan, then someone else did. And that means we still don't know the full truth." Mrs. Pritchard's expression did not change. I told you my truth, Inspector. Whether you believe me or not is beyond my control. Miss Marple turned away, her thoughts spiraling. The chessboard, the missing red knight, the letters, the attack. There was still a move left to play, and she needed to be the one to make it. She smoothed her skirt and turned back toward Morton. I believe we must gather everyone, Inspector. It is time to finish this. The drawing room of the manor was thick with tension. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long, wavering shadows against the walls. Miss Marple sat primly in a high-backed chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes surveying the room with quiet calculation. The guests had assembled at her request. Mrs. Pritchard, pale but composed, her husband standing protectively at her side. Eleanor, the young maid, wrung her hands nervously, her eyes darting toward the door. Sloan, his forehead bandaged, leaned against the mantel, his face dark with resentment. Dr. Pembroke, the ever-steady physician, remained near the window, watching everything with quiet calculation. And finally, there was Lady Margaret, seated stiffly on the edge of a chaise, her knuckles white against the silk fabric of her gown. Inspector Morton stood by the door, arms crossed. He met Miss Marple's gaze with an almost imperceptible nod. She cleared her throat softly. I believe we all now understand that Sir Geoffrey's murder was not a crime of opportunity, but of long-held resentment and justice sought in the shadows. Mrs. Pritchard has confessed to taking his life, though I suspect some of us may feel it was no great loss to the world. No one spoke. Miss Marple continued. However, we are not here simply to discuss the past, but to confront the present, because despite Mrs. Pritchard's admission, there is still a lingering darkness within these walls. The attack on Mr. Sloane was not the act of a grieving woman seeking vengeance. It was the act of someone else, someone who had yet to finish their own deadly game. A silence fell over the room. Miss Marple turned her attention to Sloane. Mr. Sloane, you were attacked in Sir Geoffrey's study, were you not? He nodded stiffly. And the blow came from behind. You did not see. Your assailant, his jaw clenched. No. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. And yet, she mused, the attack was not random. Whoever struck Mr. Sloane did so with a very specific purpose. Dr. Pembroke exhaled sharply. Which was? Miss Marple smiled. To silence him? All eyes turned to Sloane, who bristled. Silence me? That's absurd. Is it? Miss Marple tilted her head. Mr. Sloane, you and Sir Geoffrey were not merely business associates, were you? You shared something deeper, something hidden. A flicker of unease crossed Sloane's face. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, but you do, Miss Marple said gently. You knew secrets about Sir Geoffrey that no one else did, and I suspect that in the wake of his death, you became a loose end that someone desperately needed to cut. Sloane's silence was telling. Miss Marple's voice softened. You were blackmailing him, weren't you? A muscle twitched in Sloane's jaw. That's ridiculous. It isn't, Miss Marple said, her tone still kind but unyielding. You knew something about Sir Geoffrey's past, something he was desperate to keep buried, and I rather think it was that same secret that led to his murder. Her eyes flickered toward Lady Margaret. The woman's lips parted slightly, as though she had just realized she had been holding her breath. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a near whisper. Lady Margaret, I believe you have something to say." The room turned as one to face her. For a long moment, Lady Margaret said nothing. Her fingers twisted in her lap, knuckles white. And then, at last, she lifted her chin. "I knew." "She," murmured Miss Marple, nodded. "About his indiscretions?" "No," Lady Margaret whispered. "About his first wife." The room tensed. "His first wife?" Morton repeated sharply. Lady Margaret swallowed hard. "He was married before me. No one ever knew. It was years ago when he was very young. She disappeared. That was what he told me." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "She did not disappear, did she?" Lady Margaret exhaled, her eyes glistening. "No." Her voice was barely audible. "He killed her." A stunned silence fell over the room. Miss Marple let the truth settle before speaking again. "And you knew, Lady Margaret. You knew for years, and yet you stayed silent." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. "I was afraid." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. "And Mr. Sloan, he knew as well." Sloan shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but insistent. "Sir Geoffrey must have told you in a moment of drunken arrogance or weakness, and you used it against him, didn't you?" Sloan did not deny it. His silence spoke for itself. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "Which means there was only one person who had reason to want you silenced, Mr. Sloan." Her gaze landed firmly on Lady Margaret. The woman trembled, but she did not look away. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "You attacked Sloan, didn't you?" Tears slipped down Lady Margaret's cheeks. "Yes." Morton straightened. Lady Margaret closed her eyes. "I thought, if I could stop him from talking, it would end here. The shame, the whispers. I thought—" Her voice broke. "I thought I could protect my children." Miss Marple's expression softened. "It is a terrible thing to live under the shadow of a man like Sir Geoffrey." Lady Margaret let out a broken sob. Morton stepped forward, his voice regretful. "Lady Margaret, I'm afraid you'll have to come with me." She nodded numbly. Miss Marple sat back in her chair as the room dissolved into motion. The game was finished. The final move had been made. And yet, as she watched Lady Margaret being led away, a sadness settled in her chest. Justice had been served. But justice, Miss Marple knew, was rarely kind. As Lady Margaret was led away, a hush settled over the manor. The weight of the night's revelations pressed upon those who remained. Miss Marple, ever composed, watched with quiet solemnity. But something lingered at the edge of her thoughts, an itch that refused to be scratched. The case was solved. Lady Margaret had attempted to silence Sloan to protect a truth she had long buried, and Mrs. Pritchard had confessed to Sir Geoffrey's murder. Yet the pieces did not quite fit. Inspector Morton turned to Miss Marple as the door closed behind Lady Margaret. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. Quite remarkable." Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Her gaze drifted toward the chessboard. By the study's window, where the red knight still lay conspicuously missing. A small detail, and yet she rose from her seat, her steps slow, deliberate. The room watched as she moved, drawn by some silent thread of thought. She reached for the board, fingers brushing lightly over the pieces. Then she turned back, her sharp eyes landing on Sloan. "There is something I do not understand, Mr. Sloan," she said, her voice mild but firm. If Lady Margaret's intent was merely to silence you, why did she not ensure she finished the job? Sloan stiffened. She hit me hard enough, didn't she? Miss Marple shook her head. Hard enough to wound, but not to kill. That seems a curious hesitation for a woman so desperate. The room tensed. Morton frowned, stepping forward. What are you getting at, Miss Marple? She studied Sloan carefully. You never saw your attacker? He hesitated. No. But what if it was not Lady Margaret at all? Sloan let out a short, dry laugh. We just heard her confession. Miss Marple's expression did not waver. People confess to many things under duress, Mr. Sloan. That does not make them true. Silence thickened between them. Then very softly Miss Marple asked, Tell me, Mr. Sloan, where is the Red Knight? A flicker of something passed through Sloane's eyes, something guarded. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple sighed. That is a shame, because I do. She turned away, lifting a hand to the mantel where the missing chess piece should have been. Instead, something had been carefully tucked just behind the clock, a small, blood-stained scrap of fabric. She held it up. This, I believe, was torn from the sleeve of the real assailant. Morton took the cloth, examining it with narrowed eyes. This isn't from Lady Margaret's dress. No, Miss Marple said quietly. It isn't. All eyes turned to Sloan. He let out a breath, slow and measured. Then, with a small, almost amused smile, he straightened. Well, well, he murmured. I suppose I should have known you wouldn't let it go. Morton stiffened. What are you saying, Sloan? Miss Marple's voice was gentle. He is saying, Inspector, that Lady Margaret was telling the truth about one thing. She did try to silence Mr. Sloan, but she did not fail. The inspector blinked. But, Miss Marple exhaled. The man we see before us was not the same man who was struck down in Sir Geoffrey's study. A chill passed through the room. Dr. Pembroke's voice was hoarse. What are you suggesting? Miss Marple turned to Sloan. That the real Thomas... Sloan is dead. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Sloane's lips curled. A bold accusation. Miss Marple smiled thinly. Perhaps, but not without merit. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. You see, you have been careful, Mr. Sloan. Very careful. You hid in plain sight. Let the pieces fall where they may. You took the attack upon yourself as an opportunity, did you not? A chance to switch identities, to remove the one person who could tie you to the past and step into his place. Morton inhaled sharply. Then who is he? Miss Marple studied Sloan for a long moment. A ghost, she murmured. A man who was once lost, now reborn under another's name. You knew Sir Geoffrey's secret because you were part of it. But you weren't just an observer, were you? A slow, cold smile spread across Sloane's face. You were his first victim, Miss Marple finished. The silence that followed was deafening. Sloan, if that was even his name, tilted his head, considering her. Then he laughed. A low, quiet chuckle that sent shivers through the room. Well played, Miss Marple, he murmured. Well played indeed. Morton moved swiftly, reaching for his cuffs, but Sloan, whoever he truly was, raised a hand in surrender. No need for that. Inspector, he said lightly, I imagine my game is up. Miss Marple watched as he was led away, her expression unreadable. As the door closed behind him, she turned back to the chessboard, fingers brushing over the remaining pieces. The game had been far more intricate than she had imagined. But in the end, the final move had always been hers. As the heavy doors of the manor closed behind the departing officers, a strange stillness settled over the room. The echoes of the confrontation still lingered in the air, yet for Miss Marple there was no sense of triumph, only the quiet certainty that the truth had been laid bare. And yet, something still nagged at her. A loose thread, barely visible, but present nonetheless. Inspector Morton stood beside her, rubbing his temple as though the weight of the case had finally caught up to him. "A most unusual affair, Miss Marple," he muttered. "I must admit I had my doubts, but you saw through it all. A man pretending to be another, hiding in plain sight." Miss Marple gave him a small, polite smile. "Deception, Inspector, is often most effective when it is the simplest." Morton exhaled, shaking his head. "At least it's over. With his confession, I imagine we'll have no trouble securing a conviction." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She turned toward the chessboard once more, her fingers absently brushing over the remaining pieces. Her mind played back each step, each revelation, each moment of the case unfolding before her. And then, quite suddenly, she frowned. "Inspector," she said softly. Morton glanced at her. "Yes?" Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the board. "Something is amiss," he sighed. "Miss Marple," the man confessed. She shook her head, turning slowly to face him. "No, Inspector. He acknowledged my deductions, but he never admitted to killing Sir Geoffrey." Morton blinked. "What?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but there was an undeniable urgency beneath it. "We assumed that by unmasking him as an impostor, we had also unmasked the murderer, but he never once said that he committed the crime." The inspector's brow furrowed. "You think someone else killed Sir Geoffrey?" Miss Marple hesitated. "Not necessarily, but there was something peculiar about the way he spoke, as though he was amused, not guilty, not regretful, simply amused." A terrible realization gripped her. She turned sharply toward the window, looking out into the darkened estate grounds. The officers were already making their way toward the waiting car with their prisoner in tow. Her breath caught. "Inspector," but before she could speak another word, a sharp cry rang out from outside. In an instant, Morton was moving, flinging the door open and rushing into the cold night air. Miss Marple followed, her heart pounding. The scene that greeted them was chaos. The officers were on the ground, groaning in pain, their weapons scattered. The carriage door swung open, but the man, Sloan, or whatever his name had been, was gone, vanished into the darkness. Morton swore under his breath, spinning toward the nearest constable. "What happened?" The man struggled to his feet, clutching his head. He had something hidden. A blade, I think, cut through the bindings. Moved like the devil himself. Took us by surprise." Morton clenched his fists. Blast it all. Miss Marple stood very still, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness beyond the estate grounds. He was gone, and she knew, with a quiet certainty, that he would not be found. Morton turned back toward her, frustration clear on his face. "We'll set up a search at once." Miss Marple, however, shook her head. "You won't find him." The inspector's jaw tightened. "You sound certain?" She met his gaze, her voice steady. because he planned this all along. Morton exhaled sharply, his frustration giving way to something more like resignation. So he gets away with it. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, considering. Then she shook her head. No, Inspector. He may have escaped justice in the eyes of the law, but men like him do not simply disappear. He has been unmasked, and that is his greatest weakness. The world now knows he exists, and one day that will be his undoing. Morton exhaled, nodding slowly. I hope you're right, Miss Marple. She turned back toward the house, her mind already working through the final pieces of the puzzle. There was something more to this, something deeper than even she had first suspected. Because for all his cunning, for all his careful deception, he had left something behind, and Miss Marple would not rest until she found it. Miss Marple sat quietly, in the drawing room of the manor, her knitting needles clicking softly in the otherwise silent space. The fire had burned low in the hearth, the last embers casting a faint glow against the walls. Inspector Morton had left some time ago, his men scattering in different directions in search of the fugitive. But she knew it was futile. He was too clever, too prepared. He had slipped away into the night like a wisp of smoke, and yet her mind was not troubled by his escape. No, there was something else, an itch at the back of her thoughts, a detail that refused to settle. Her gaze drifted to the chessboard. The pieces still stood as they had been left, frozen in the moment before the game was abandoned. She had set them herself that morning, absent-mindedly arranging them into a familiar position. A famous game from decades past, a match she had once read about in an old newspaper, and then a sudden stillness overcame her. She rose from her chair, moving toward the board with careful steps, her fingers hovering over the Queen's Knight. A memory surfaced, that look in his eyes. Not fear, not regret, amusement. The pieces clicked softly as she moved the knight to its intended square. Checkmate, the exact position she had arranged that morning, the exact position she had found when she returned to the room after his capture. But she had been the only one to touch the board. Her breath slowed, her mind sharpening like a blade. No, not the only one. Someone else had been here. Someone who had noticed, who had recognized the placement, who had deliberately moved it back. A quiet dread settled over her. It had been a message, not from the man who had fled into the night, but from someone still here. Someone watching. Someone who had known the truth long before she had. The fire crackled, and in its glow, the shadows shifted ever so slightly. Miss Marple straightened, smoothing the front of her dress with steady hands. The case was over. The murderer was revealed. And yet as she turned away from the chessboard, her eyes dark and thoughtful, she knew the mystery was far from finished.